Okay, it is Tuesday, September the 1st, 2020, and welcome to week 4 of Introduction to Criminal Law. I'm Professor Richard Wright, and I told you we're in the crossing over to the second half of the course. By now, you should have taken the midterm exam, which was due on Sunday. And you should be aware that at the end of this week, which is a week from Sunday, I will no longer accept assignments from weeks 1 to 3 unless arrangements have been made with me, and I don't have anybody particularly that has reached out to me with extenuating circumstances. Be aware that even if you turn in your assignments before next Sunday uh, ends, you'll still lose points unless there is some extenuating circumstances that you've made me aware of. As I said from the very beginning of this course, feel free to reach out to me any hour of the day except the 25th hour of the day, text, email, phone, so forth and so on. And I haven't received very many. And then the other thing I want to remind you is that if you see a 0 in your grade book, be aware that every Monday after assignments are due, such as last Sunday, that your assignments were due, that on Monday, which was yesterday, I do what we call a weekly scrub, and I do go through and I check to see if you've completed your assignments. And if not, I put a 0 in there. And the purpose of the 0 is to let you know that you haven't completed the assignment. And then secondly, it's also there to remind you that you need to get those assignments in. And then finally, your advisors are aware of the fact that you're not performing in the class. And your GPA will reflect the 0 in there. Until I put a 0 in there, it doesn't change it. So I have to put a 0 by the policy of the school. There are students who think that once they see the 0, they say, I didn't even give him a chance to submit it late. You still can submit it if you see the 0. That's the point that you should be aware of. And I didn't mention this before, but I want to make sure that you're aware of it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Here we are. And you're well aware of the fact that rubrics are located in each written assignment. Lectures 1 to 3. Lecture 4 will be placed in here. And then finally, tonight, we're at lecture 4. So we have 2 more lectures after this. All right. And then be aware of the fact that the course is almost over. We're in September, and your initial posts are due tonight on obstruction of justice. Your reading yesterday was given and told you what to read, and I sent you the PowerPoints for that corresponding week's assignment. And then your reply post due Saturday the 12th. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I jumped ahead. Your reply post due the 5th, and then your um, initial post will be due on, not your initial post, but your written assignment um, will be due along with your key phrase. Written assignment, fleeing, eluding, and then your live lecture key phrase. All right. And then you'll notice that next week, starting on the 7th, and next week on the 8th, you'll see that the following week, the class ends on the 18th. Does not end on the 19th. It ends on the 18th. I say this every week, and I guarantee you there will be some students who still won't get it. Okay. So that's the course calendar. Let me close that up. It's available to you from day one. It's closed. Okay. So now let's go back to the course homepage and let's take a quick look at the announcement for the week. Okay, week 4. Here it is. Crimes against government and public order. I'll be discussing today. Chapter 8 of the textbook. Again, I sent you the corresponding PowerPoints for that. And then we're going to talk about domestic terrorism, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, fleeing police, disorderly conduct, and free speech. And then, the practice that I tell you, pay close attention of the key terms. And then there's a practice quiz as well. Again, your discussion post, obstruction of justice, is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then your reply post is due Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then your written assignment is fleeing or eluding police. That's your written assignment. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. And then if you can complete the mid-quarter survey, and you know about adversity as the springboard to success. By the way, your week 2 grades will be completed by the end of tomorrow. I was trying to get them in over the weekend, but a lot of things are going on. Okay. So let's take a look at the module itself and see the assignments. Of course, your discussion, obstruction of justice. So you're going to utilize this scenario. And then for your initial post, consider what you know about Terry versus Ohio. This is the old stop and frisk case for your information. And if you click on this, it'll take you to what you need to know. And then you'll answer these questions in your initial post. In your reply post, you're going to look at another student's post that may contrast with yours. Defend your position regarding all 4 questions. And then if you want to do an additional reply post, that's fine as well. And then here's guides to help you in the criminal law course that I talk to you about every week. So if you click on this, it will take you to the guide, and it will discuss discussion posts and give you a video to help you with your weekly written assignment, remind you about Grammarly as I shared with you, the APA, online library, finding statutes and cases, new students, resources, and so forth. All these things that I talked to you about during the first week. Okay. So now let's move on down to the written assignment, the sole written assignment after that. So this is a 2-part exam paper. Now, be aware of the fact that the first part of your paper, you're going to do using this scenario, and you're going to examine the U.S. Supreme Court cases that apply to real-world scenarios about this scenario. And here's the Supreme Court case. And here's some sample pursuit policies. Now, here's what you're going to do. In a minimum of 2 pages, APA formatted as you know the rubric requires, double space, Roman 12, a cover page. Make sure your margins are in compliant as well. There are students sometimes who have a whole big margin on each side in order to try to fill a page. You lose points that way because you have to do it APA formatted. So then you're going to address each of these questions, of the 5 questions. All right. Make sure it says in 6, if you use your textbook, try to minimize the use of your textbook. Use outside sources because you have enough. Include, as I said, the APA requirement for the citation and the formatted proper setup. And be sure to cite the sources. So it says, if you use your textbook or outside sources, and there's no if, you are going to have sources to support your statements for APA purposes. And you're going to answer each of these 5 questions in your writing. You're not going to number them, but you're going to make sure you address each of them. And again, you're going to look at the cases. And then there is a sample, reviewing the sample pursuit policy that's given here. The second part, you're going to create your own original flyer, okay, using review the statute, and then in your flyer explain the elements of the statute that must apply. This statute, not your state statute. And then refer to the sample police pursuit policy that you used in your first part of your assignment regarding this subject, and or you may also select a pursuit policy of your choice. Just be sure to cite it at the end of the work. And then you're going to deal with these 2 issues in your flyer. Make sure that you use the template because it helps you as well. Be sure to provide and cite your sources that you use to create the flyer as well. And then you can submit it either in the zip, or you can submit it as 2 separate files attached. So it tells you how to do zips. Some students don't do zips, and I don't mind that because actually it's slower for me grading when there's zips. But the point of the matter is that you could do it either way. But make sure that you get that done. So now let's quickly take a look at the rubric for 40 points. And so 15 of your points involve dealing with the types of crimes that are involved, what's involved with the police pursuit, and that's a minimum of 2 pages. And then make sure that it's in paragraph form, proper spelling, and all of that. APA. Never use Wikipedia. And then for the second part of the assignment, you'll get 15 points. If you satisfy all of these, this should be at least a full page minimum. Okay. And that's your rubric. Very important, as I remind students, to match up your rubric with what you're doing. And actually, that's the those are the assignments. The only other thing is you're going to give is the key phrase. So very important that you follow this. Get this in by Sunday. That's when it's due in at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. So now let's go to my discussion about crimes against public disorder. So we're going to deal with domestic terrorism, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, fleeing police, disorderly conduct, and free speech. We'll conclude and then we'll kind of go over some of these samples. So we are in a society right now where violence seems to be around us on every hand, and there are different levels of terrorism that are involved. But the key thing about terrorism that you should be aware is that it involves force and violence. And usually there are people who lose their lives or are seriously injured. And the terrorism that we talk about is against the government, and the purpose for the terrorism is to force the government to do something or to try to intimidate the government. So the FBI deals with terrorism especially on the international level, but and so if it's carried within the United States by an international group such as ISIS or any other, then it's domestic. Terrorism can also be targeted at specific causes that a person wants to. It's weird. They want to cause, but they do it by threatening, or it's almost like extorting, forcing someone to go with their position. And so we're going to talk about the difference between the international and domestic terrorism. So the key thing, keep remembering, is that it could be carried out either domestically or internationally. When it's carried out domestic, there are groups within the United States that want to force their position on the government or don't like the Constitution or the laws as they exist, and rather than vote to change, they want to take it by force. The second is foreign groups outside the United States. That's when we get into international terrorism. Now, international terrorism can take place on our soil, as you'll hear me talk about in just a few minutes. So now let's talk about the definition of international terrorism. So the United States Code, which is Chapter 18 of the United States Code, which lays out all criminal laws in the country on the federal level, says international terrorism acts as dangerous to human life, as you'll discover both of them do, occur primarily outside of the United States, or if it's upon U.S. soil by a foreign terrorist organization or member. 3, a violation of our laws of any jurisdiction, and it appears, and the purpose of it is to intimidate or coerce the civilian population to go with their position, or influence the policy of a government intimidation and affect the conduct. The greatest demonstration of international terrorism happened roughly the anniversary will be 10 days from now, in September, which was September the 11th, or 911. And you should be aware that they chose 911 because we use 911 for emergencies. And so, as you have learned historically, that the World Trade Center buildings in New York were struck by airplanes, and they went down before our eyes, and there were people who were killed. Many people died. First responders also died as a result of that. You should be aware that international terrorism of September 11th carried on all kinds of health hazards for first responders that have taken place even as we speak now, and people who have gotten lung problems and so forth. But it devastated the country on a financial level because it was in the heart of the Wall Street area where our financial markets were. And it was planned. Uh, and the interesting part about those attacks is that they were foreign individuals who were in the United States. And here's the sad part about it is that the individuals who actually directed, and matter of fact, those were just two parts of it. There's a third part I'll tell you. But the ones who flew those planes into the World Trade Center towers were trained down in Florida how to land a plane, not how to land a plane, how to take off a plane, but they didn't learn how to land. Now, if you're recognizing that that's all a student wants to learn, there that should send up a red flag because they become what we call kamikaze. That is, they will sacrifice their lives so that they can accomplish their mission. And so what happened is that, of course, these people died who did it, but they did it for their government or their organization to intimidate the United States and an attempt to bring the United States of America's financial status to its knees. And as a result of that, also on September 11th, there were individuals who tried to crash planes into the Pentagon in New York, I mean, in DC. And there was also a plane that crashed in Pennsylvania where an individual struggled and people died on that as well. The bottom line is that it was a sad day in our country as it comes to terrorism. It actually changed the way that we operated. It resulted in the creation of the Patriot Act and the passing of it to trying to deal with terrorism from that point. It also resulted in the creation of an agency that we now know very well as Homeland Security. And so Department of Homeland Security, DHS, exists now and is does a lot of things now on dealing with international terrorism. And so it happened right here. Prior to that, there were other attacks. There was an attack in New York. I believe it was before, but it wasn't of the magnitude of the World Trade Center. After the World Trade Center, airplane flying, everything changed. Um, how you're going through checkpoints more, um, dealing with checking individuals as they boarded planes. The amount of luggage that you could carry on the plane became regulated and controlled. There were more dogs, drug sniffing dogs, or bomb sniffing dogs at the airports as a result of that. We went to a phase where we would fly these flags, and we don't do them anymore, where on when the government saw that there were things that might happen, they had flags that flew of a different color, letting you know of the likelihood of an attack during that time. And every year since that time, when we come to it, and you'll hear about it this year, is that when you get right up on September the 11th, that there'll be, of course, commemoration of the deaths of loss of lives, and then you'll also discover that the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and all the agencies that deal with international terrorism will be on high alert. So that's international, okay? Remember, carried out on U.S. soil by a foreign terrorist group, maybe ISIS or Al Qaeda, those kinds of groups. Next, we have domestic terrorism. Now, we have a lot of that type of thing that's happening, and there are individuals that commit these offenses, and it's carried out from within our country, where American citizens are attacking the government, or they'll commit violence on behalf of some government, and their aim is similar to the international terrorist groups. And what they want to do is maintain and get their position out. I'll talk about some specifics in a minute. And so some examples are the Olympic Park bomber, where Eric Rudolph targeted anti-abortion clinics, which resulted in deaths and injuries to 2 people and 200 injuries. And the key thing is that the primary target is the government, but individuals are hurt, and then they announce that they're responsible for it. In some other instances, the target is a government entity, such as what happened with the major one that we know of, and that was the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, where Timothy McVeigh and I forget his partner's name, targeted the federal building in Oklahoma City, and they had a large truck bomb, and it resulted in killing 168 people and injuring more than 600 women and children. There was actually a daycare center in that building, and many kids lost their lives. And the purpose for that was to avenge the handling of Ruby Ridge in Idaho, where a federal agent was killed along with a 14-year-old child. And it doesn't bear any logic, but that was what they did. And Timothy McVeigh believed that Ruby Ridge was improperly handled by the federal government, and the death of the 14-year-old child was unnecessary. But isn't it interesting that that's the rationale, but that they pulled off an act in Oklahoma City that resulted in many more children being killed, and you know, 168 people, and women and children. It defies logic, but that's what happens. And so when we deal with domestic terrorism, we find ourselves where, for example, the shooting that took place in most recently that you're familiar with in Las Vegas, where the guy was, we never really got to the bottom of that, because when the person is killed, it's kind of hard to determine what the causes are. In the Oklahoma City bombings, the individuals were arrested, and you're going to see how that happened in just a few minutes. But the fact of the matter is that you can look at um, um, situations that happened down in Florida at a nightclub dealing with gay and lesbian. There was that, and then there was one out in I think it was, I want to say San Bernardino, California, but I'm not sure, but it was in California. And you look at, whenever things happen, there's some group that comes forward and claim um, that they are responsible for the offense. So who investigates domestic terrorism on the federal level? I told you the FBI, Homeland Security, but domestic terrorism that happens on our land is investigated by the federal government, of course, and it becomes a joint effort at the federal, state, and local level, where authorities work together to conduct an investigation to put together the pieces. However, though, the crimes that are committed are enhanced not just with the state crimes, but to a federal level. And where some states don't have the death penalty, then the federal level, when it goes to it, they do qualify individuals for the death penalty. So let's show you what happened with Timothy McVeigh. He was caught by an Oklahoma um, state trooper on a minor traffic stop. And when he realized who he had, that's how it happens. Eric Rudolph, responsible for the Oklahoma Park bombing, was apprehended by a patrol officer who was checking behind a closed strip mall and found him in the area, and then realized who they had. So what happens is that the federal government, along with the local jurisdictions, deal with the arrests and investigations. But as I said earlier, the prosecution of these crimes are, even though they happen on a state level, are federal in nature because it's domestic terrorism, and they are prosecuted at the federal level for the reasons I stated above. The penalties are higher. And so everybody works together on these things. All right. So now you have an idea about this against the government. So now let's talk about obstruction of justice. So what is obstruction of justice? The term kind of speaks for itself, and it has to do with a number of factors. Some people think obstruction of justice is merely not telling the truth, but it's more than that, and it's purposely misleading the authorities in an investigation, and it can take place on the streets as well as in a courtroom. Of course, when it takes place in a courtroom, it rises to a level of a crime called perjury, and that comes after you have taken an oath. Raise your right hand as shown in this picture to tell the truth, or you affirm that you would tell the truth during a court proceeding. It also applies, you should be aware, in congressional hearings as well, or governmental hearings where you affirm to tell the truth, and then it turns out that you lied, and so and you can find yourself in deep water for committing perjury under those situations. Now, remember, in order for it to be perjury, you had to have been untruthful after you took an oath. Okay. Now, you should be aware of the fact that you could commit perjury, not just by saying and raising your hand. If you look at documents that you sign, particularly when it involves using public funds, whether it's on a federal or state level, you will see in the document itself the statements that say that if you are not truthful, you could be subject to the penalty of perjury, such as applying for welfare, lying on your income tax, lying to get some government funds on a SBA loan or some kind of government loan. There are people who are involved with the pandemic that got the PPP loans and committed perjury by signing the docs saying that they had a certain number of employees or something that qualified them which really wasn't true, and or they lied and applied for more than one using different organization names, but so they can get it. So obstruction of justice during a formal proceeding is perjury, but also written. On the streets, if, for example, you're stopped by the police and you're not required to talk to them because the Fifth Amendment says that. But if you do choose to answer questions, you have to be honest because they're going to operate and rely on that. Lying on the police is a criminal law violation because what the law, as it says here, what the violation does, it misleads and prevents the police from performing their duties or sends them out on a wild goose chase. One of the most famous ones in our area here in Illinois, which most people know across the country, resulted in an individual by the name of Jesse Smollett, who was a star on the TV series Empire, alleging that he was attacked and dealt with racial and homophobic by two individuals, and then the investigation sent police out looking for these individuals, and it turns out that based on the details of the investigation that it was really staged by him because he was trying to get back at the people who were that he worked for to try to get more money. And so as a result of that, he committed obstruction of justice, and many hours of investigation took place only to find out that he filed a false report. And so that can result in that. Okay. In some states, obstruction of justice include a requirement that people identify themselves when their name is asked by a person. So, in other words, a person in some jurisdictions, and it's in a statute, Ohio statute, in our example here, failure to disclose personal information states that no person who is in a public area shall refuse to disclose their name, address, date of birth when requested by law enforcement officers who suspect reasonably that the person is committing or has committed or is about to commit a criminal offense. Now, the police can't just stop people just to stop them. But the bottom line, it should be based upon a reasonable belief that the person is either committing a crime or about to commit a crime. The person witnessed any of the following: an offense of violence, a felony offense, and any attempt to conspire or commit any of the above, and any conduct listed that has been about to be committed. So everybody is familiar with this statute because of the famous stop and frisk case, which you guys are studying this week, Terry versus Ohio. And in that case, it made it clear that a person engaged in a stop can be asked for their name, address, and date of birth. And it's a misdemeanor. They don't. However, what has made this a landmark case was the search that takes place, that there is a parameter that you'll discover when you read Terry versus Ohio, that you can only temporarily detain an individual, and that the purpose of the search is to determine if the person has weapons for the protection of the officer or anyone. So it is interesting. But look at what Wisconsin has: a temporary questioning without arrest, provide the ability to stop, temporarily detain, and demand the name of a person who is suspected of being involved in criminal activity. However, no provision within that statute compels a person to identify themselves, and there's no legal ramifications. So in this case, in Wisconsin, failing to identify can be a factor that police consider, but refusing is not prohibited within the state like it is in Ohio. Remember, it must be on the books and the jurisdiction. So it says here that the Wisconsin police must use more investigative powers, such as consulting local booking, photos, looking for physical identification such as scars, tattoos, or even acquaintances for assistance. So, and it doesn't permit, the law in Wisconsin doesn't permit the police um, to conduct an exterior pat down and minimal intrusion to remove a wallet um, to help. So you can't take their wallet out, anything like that. So take a look at this information that's under here and you'll understand how that works. Resisting arrest, very simply, is this: if you're under arrest and you do anything to try to, such as fleeing, such as maybe kicking or struggling. So, and how do you know if you're under arrest? Well, there's several ways. There's what we call explicit custody, where it makes it clear when a person says you're under arrest. Okay, that right there is an instruction that's clear. However, though, there is implicit custody, and this is a point that I always remind students to be careful of, is not as clear. And the question is, what would a reasonable person believe is taking place? So when the person reasonably believes that they can't go, that their liberty is taken away, that they cannot walk away, they may perceive they're under arrest. One of the questions that you can ask is, can I go? If you are told no, then that is a form of implicit custody. And so the whole thing is that it's very important that those of you who are familiar with the Miranda case and recognizing the fact that you have to give the rights before you question, as soon as that person is deemed to be in custody and you start to question them, and if they give you information and you have not given them the Miranda rights, a great attorney that I did a lot of that is to file a motion to suppress, and those statements will be removed as evidence in a criminal trial. So police must be constantly mindful of whether or not a person is under arrest, whether it's implicitly or explicitly. Very, very, very important. Resisting arrest, as I said, can be punching, kicking, or those kind of things. And in terms of dealing with this, in some jurisdictions, Tennessee is an example, resisting stop, frisk, or halt is a Class A misdemeanor for a person to intentionally prevent or obstruct anyone known to be a law enforcement officer. See, and that's the key thing. They got to know it's a law enforcement officer, or that person's in a position that appears to be a law enforcement officer, acting in the presence of that person, and does something to not that they're trying to stop the individual. Frisk, halt, arrest, or search any person, including the defendant, by using force against the officer. So you can't do that. You just have to be still. If a person in Tennessee uses a deadly weapon for resist arrest, the nature is then, of course, increased to a Class A misdemeanor. All right. The final thing, well, there are two things. I'm going to quickly just talk about the vehicle pursuit and fleeing. You guys have an assignment that you have to do with this. Um, Fleeing from police officers, such as running away, is as kind of dangerous. And police officers have been hurt or injured during foot chases. However, um, it is very careful that the police must be familiar with Garner versus Tennessee, dealing with the parameters of the actions that they can take as far as using uh, deadly force. And you can't substitute shooting an individual who's fleeing if they're not a danger to someone. Um, and if you do that as a police officer, you are going to be placed in a situation as police officers were in the case of Laquan McDonald, the investigation that's taking place involving the young man up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, most recently, and those kinds of things. There was a case that was in, I believe, North Carolina years ago involving a young man by the name of George Scott, who was shot by a police officer in the back. He was fleeing. He had no weapon on him, and the police officer shot him and then tried to plant a gun on him, but all this was caught on video. The point of the matter is that the police can find themselves um, in hot water. Okay. But let's talk about the dangers of vehicle pursuits, because of the fact that there's the most dangerous pursuits involve vehicles for a number of reasons. Because you're driving a street where more people are walking as pedestrians, or either right driving themselves, and you create a fleeing and eluding, which is serious. And for example, it talks about the New York statute: a person is guilty of unlawfully fleeing a police officer in a vehicle in the third degree, knowing that they've been directed to stop and they take off. And they attempt to flee such officer by driving at speeds equal or exceeding 25 miles per hour above the speed limit, reckless driving. And so when a police officer um, um, goes after that individual, the police officers are trained, and there are pursuit policies in place, because of the fact that police officers should be aware that even though they're pursuing an individual, that they could also seriously injure or kill innocent parties, or they themselves can be injured or killed in those vehicle pursuits. And so the key thing is that Wisconsin Emergency Vehicle and Operation Control Manual, due regard, is something that police officers must take into context of chasing, pursuing someone in a vehicle, that degree that a reasonable person would do in a similar situation. During driving, that the police must consider what time of day it is, the volume of pedestrian and vehicle traffic, nature of the offense, the conditions of the road, weather, speeds, and the ability, which you're trained in the academy to deal with this. And then there are sample pursuit policies, which I'm not going to pull up, obviously, because you got to do that yourself. And the police must keep in mind the due regard of the police pursuit policy. It says, if the risk of the pursuit outweighs necessity for pursuit or immediate apprehension, then discontinuing or terminating the pursuit may be necessary. So you might have to let them go. I know it might be bad for your ego, but it's still part of that. And the reason for that is to protect the lives of people, innocent parties. And there are other techniques that we're going to share in just a few minutes. And then if you check this article, you'll see. And so if you look at the case of Scott versus Harris, and that's one of the ones you should consider for your written assignment. There are techniques that are taught by police, such as ramming the motorist, but there's a certain method to do it. I'll share a little bit of that with you in a few minutes. Roadblocks, and there are some other techniques. And the key thing is to consider what exactly is going on. They give some examples here. Fleeing driver suspected of a violent felony increases to 45 miles an hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, but the suspect stops at lights and uses turn signals. These driving behaviors alone are not overly dangerous, and ramming would not be justified. On the other hand, the same suspect is traveling at 90 in a 30, makes certain turns, drive through the signals, nearly hits other vehicles, then ramming may be justified. And similar fact circumstances were explored in this Scott versus Harris case, a very pivotal case. And we had these various techniques that we learned when I was in the academy to force to stop individuals. And we call the PIT, pursuit intervention technique. If you look at it, you see how the police car is along with the target. And then what you will do is hit the left back and try to get it to spin around. Okay. And then that would stop the individual. But you have to be very careful and recognize the vicinity of where you're doing that as well. And then there's other techniques such as the stop sticks. You've seen those at parking lots where you pull into a parking lot and you try to back out. You know what happens is that these pointy things will deflate your tires and slow you down, and that kind of thing. Partial roadblocks is another method that we talked about a few minutes ago. Boxing in is where there's police cars on each side and bring the car to a stop as well. So those are just some of the things. The final thing I want to talk to you about is disorderly conduct. We have a free speech. You have a right to say things, but you can't say things that incite people. That's the key thing. And any form of speech that inflames or creates confrontation, we call them fighting words, can result in disorderly conduct or breach of the peace in most jurisdictions by using obscenities, profanities, boisterous language, and for example, in Ohio, Idaho, here's a statute disturbing the peace, and it's a misdemeanor. Every person who maliciously and willfully disturbs the peace or quiet by loud, unusual noise, tumultuous, offensive conduct, or threatening to fight, those kinds of things, uses vulgar language and so forth, can do something to provoke an individual. All right. And there's a nice video down here that is about 35 minutes if you want to take a look at it. And it demonstrates disorderly conduct and that kind of thing. Okay. And that's all I have for you today on this. Before I give you the key, I want to show you how you can prepare using this material to get ready for your exam. Use your flashcards and run this if you have to so you can get it started. And there we go. So you go over each of these questions and then you flip it over When it occurs in a vehicle, is the act of failing to stop for police after motorist has received an instruction from a police officer. We just talked about it. Fleeing or eluding police. Go to the next one. Laws that prohibit the use of obscenities, profane, voiceless language. And we just covered that. That's disorderly conduct. Okay. Degree of care that reasonably a person must performing similar duties and acting under similar circumstances. What is that degree of care called? Due regard. So those are some of the things, and there's more, and you use those to help you prepare for your exam. Then there are practice for disorderly conduct or free speech, and you go through the same kind of scenario where you start the activity. A man walking in the middle of the street, um, yelling profanities. Is this free speech or disorderly conduct? Based on what we just learned, it's disorderly conduct. Abortion activists are standing on a street corner holding a signs of aborted fetuses that some citizens have cited as offensive. Is this free speech? You might not like it, but it's free speech. It's a peaceful protest. And then the last one I'll do. Edward is watching a movie with some friends inside the theater. And this is actually based upon a famous case that we studied. I think it's Shank. Um, uh, that is half full and yells fire in a theater. And 10 patrons run. One patron calls police, complaining, is this free speech? You can't do that because of the stampede that it would cause. So it is considered disorderly conduct. Okay. Again, it is a famous case that we studied when I was in law school that actually says you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And what they were really saying was you can't incite people because people can be hurt and trampled upon. And then the final thing is the quiz itself, which I've already shared and caution you, be sure that you take these because several of these questions are on the exam. And a local resident suspecting of setting off a truck bomb at a religious temple, intentionally targeting the parishioners. This is an example of, well, a local resident. So it is domestic terrorism, someone within their own country. A foreign national living in your country is part of a terrorist organization from another country and intentionally blows up City Hall. This is an example of international because it's carried out even though it happened on the soil. And remember I said it could be on the soil or not, as September the 11th by a terrorist group outside the United States. And then the last one, you stop a man that you believe was about to break into a store, but stopped when he saw your marked squad car. You question him and he lies about his name. What will you place him under arrest for? Perjury, burglary, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice. He just lied. Okay. So that's it for today. I want to give you a key phrase, and that key phrase is something that you should be aware of. for this month. And that's international terrorism. That's it. Give it to me and you get your points. International terrorism. So I'm going to say good night. See you guys next week, same time. And any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and have a good evening.